It's important to remember that when we slip out of or away from the truth, we're doing that for a good reason. It's like, our contradictions and our false opinions, just like the mind, they're not bad guys. The mind is a brilliant evolutionary development. Rational thinking, calculative, predictive, analytical thinking it's a miracle. But the mind also has certain limitations where if you are identified with the mind, that's the problem. It's not the mind, it's identification with that. If you identify with that, then it becomes the master, and that's not a good idea. Because the mind is not really constituted to recognize truth.
Welcome to Mew. Today's episode is our third and final in our series with Philip Golabuk. Philip is the founder of the PhilosophyCenter, where they offer philosophical counseling sessions for coming into greater awareness, personal evolution, and a deeper appreciation for the miracle, mystery, and opportunity of being alive. If you enjoy this podcast, you can help support it by joining the Patreon at the link below. And so with that, I'm very happy to introduce this interview with Philip Golabuk. So, in our first conversation, we talked a lot about truth and freedom from suffering, the relationship of being in truth, living in truth, and it being almost having the same identity as freedom from suffering, that they're not separate. So we talked about being in the truth of what's a yes or a no for oneself, the truth of, for example, life direction. There's this other area of truths about life principles. So I was curious if you could, say, list the life principles as you see them and discuss how people get caught up in them and maybe get into some examples.
Well, I wouldn't list. I mean, in our life coach training program, I've identified 8 life principles. I wouldn't go into all of them for a couple of reasons, but we could touch on some of them and talk about what it would mean to be in conflict with a life principle and how that would produce suffering. Truth is the first one. So it may seem circular that if we're not being truthful with ourselves and with others, that's not going to go well. So that's going to create suffering. Uncertainty is also a life principle. There's just so much we don't know. There's so much we don't know. And so what we find, a lot, it's just really kind of ironic in philosophical counseling sessions. We often find that clients will say, I know, when they don't know. And they'll say, I don't know, when they do know. So usually I don't know when they really do know means I don't want to know, or I'm not willing to know. There's something they're not willing to face. So that they experience that as I don't know. And if you ask the right questions, it doesn't take long to get to the knowledge they have. I mean, Socrates talked about truth as recollection, that we all possess the truth. And coming to the truth consciously is just an act of recollection. It's like an act of remembering. And so in cases where clients don't want to know what they need to know, what they're not willing to know, you ask the right questions, just the way Socrates did in one of the dialogues, and he demonstrates this, how knowledge is recollection, or coming to the truth is recollection. Then suddenly they know, and their experience when they come to that is, oh, I knew that. Yeah, it's like, I knew that all along, but they knew it, but the way Socrates puts it is, we possess the knowledge in forgetfulness, which is a really nice way to put it. And so coming to the truth of, so that's a big part of the truth. And what balances that life principle is uncertainty, which is that to be truthful means to be willing to say, I don't know, when that's the truth. And there's always going to be a lot we don't know. And even in matters that are really important to us. There are going to be things that we just don't know. So it's important to acknowledge uncertainty when that's what's going on, and to sort of own not knowing, and also to own knowing when we do know. So there's a balance there. It's very practical. Change is another life principle. If we're usually the problems that we run into, or we see in session, is with respect to the life principles, is that clients are either denying the life principle or exaggerating it. So, for example, with respect to change, as life is change. It goes back to Heraclitus. It's a Buddhist idea too, impermanence, right? Life is change. And so if we're in denial of change, if we're like clinging to the past, or not, if something is trying to change in our life, or it's already changed, and we're denying that, that's going to create suffering. And then it's also possible to exaggerate the life principles, and be sort of pushing the river for change, trying to force change when change isn't ready to happen yet. So it all comes down to, with the life principles, and being truthful about the life principles, not being in conflict with them or set against them. It always comes down to neither exaggerating nor denying the life principle, which really it comes down to being truthful. Truthfulness is like the master principle of philosophical self-work, which makes sense. You think about it. And another way to say that is, if we were just truthful, but really through and through truthful, then we wouldn't need to know about the life principles or anything else. Like, that would handle everything, right? Because denying the truth is a way of being untruthful, and exaggerating the truth is a way of also not being truthful. So if we're just truthful, we're kind of in balance, and we talk about that as alignment. And that's the path away from suffering, or out of suffering.
One important life principle that I'd be interested in you sharing or talking more about is that of, is it boundaries? I'm not sure what the Cartman drama triangle, if that fits into a particular life principle.
Yeah, limitation.
Limitation.
Yeah, we have responsibility. Another life principle is responsibility. We're all responsible for some things. And again, denying or exaggerating that gives rise to a lot of problems. You see a lot of both denial and exaggeration of responsibility going on in it's been called the drama triangle, or it was devised by Stephen Cartman, who was a student of Eric Berne, who's the guy that founded transactional analysis. And Cartman came up with this brilliant idea of identifying certain social roles that we can fall into, which are dysfunctional, toxic roles. I mean, talk about creating suffering. That's all that goes on inside the drama triangle, or the Cartman triangle, it's sometimes called. And he identified these three, hence the term triangle, these three roles of rescuer, persecutor, victim. And that defines a certain sort of area where people have social transactions that are really dysfunctional and create a lot of suffering. And so in terms of the life principles, we talk about, responsibility and limitation. You're bringing up boundaries that would correspond to what we talk about as limitation, that there are, actually falls between responsibility and limitation. We can also talk about it in terms of diligence, that there are things for us to do in truth. We have certain responsibilities, all of us, and these responsibilities are rightly ours. And then there are things that are not ours. They wouldn't fall within the circle of diligence. So, for example, they might be that diligence might belong to somebody else, right? So, or maybe nobody else. Maybe it's just something that's out of our hands, and it just has to play out like what the Stoics talked about as fate. So if you sort of find the balance point, the sort of sweet spot between responsibility as a life principle and limitation as a life principle, it really pretty much delineates what you mean by boundaries. So it's very important, in order to live in alignment, that we recognize boundaries and not slip into the drama triangle, where all of these dysfunctional transactions happen and people create a lot of suffering. Anytime we're trying to rescue somebody, we're trying to do what's rightly theirs to do. We're trying to, that's usurping. It's codependent, and it's entangled, and it's not in the quantum sense, and not in the good sense. It's entangled in the psychological, problematic, dysfunctional sense. And so it's important to know where that boundary is, what's mine to do and what's not mine to do, and not try to do what's not mine to do, even with good intentions. Like, the rescuer's favorite word is help. I'm helping this other person. The problem is you're trying to do for that person what he or she needs to do personally. That's not yours to do. And other circumstances, it's more like just I'm trying to do something that it's not in my hands to do. That, like a situation, maybe somebody I care about is sick, and I've done everything I can do to truly be helpful and supportive without any boundary incursions going on. But then it has to play out, and that's the timing is not in my hands. So it's important to recognize when something is not in our hands, which comes right out of the whole Stoic camp. Epictetus said, if you find yourself, this is great advice, even especially for us in modern life. He said, if you find yourself in a problematic or distressing situation, just ask yourself one question: is this in my hands? And if the answer is no, he said, be prepared to say to it, you're nothing to me. It's to be that indifferent to these forces that are indifferent to us. You have to meet these, the Stoics talked about them as indifferent conditions of fate, that you have to be prepared to meet them with indifference. Because there's nothing you can do about it. It's really the only sane thing you can do is recognize that you can't do anything. It's kind of like Socrates recognizing his wisdom in knowing he had no wisdom. So yeah, boundaries are really an important part of alignment. And I think maybe even most of the problems that clients bring to sessions have to do with the failure to recognize a boundary, either to recognize a limitation or fail to recognize a responsibility. So the boundary gets blurry, and it gets really unclear who's doing what and who owns what diligence, and what, where to move and where to refrain from moving. And it's finding those balances is really a lot of coming back into alignment and extracting the boundaries back out of that codependent triangle so that you have that kind of clear, grounded, present awareness, and that informs behavior. The clarity of that informs behavior, and then the relationships kind of come right. I mean, they just come right very quickly when you stop doing that stuff that creates suffering. That's often all that's needed.
Yeah, what's coming up for me is it's like this idea that much has been done in the name of being a good person.
Yeah. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Right?
Or that, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's the saying. Yeah, we've all heard it. It's true. We mean well, but that's not enough.
So one thing I'm interested in doing here is, setting up the life principles such that anyone that's listening can bring them into their own life and almost use them as a checklist. If you fall into suffering, you can kind of see, is there some sort of place here that I'm not recognizing the truth of? So if you have anything else to offer here around life principles, it'd be helpful.
Well, I think truth, uncertainty, responsibility, and limitation, that's half of them. And I said I had other reasons for not wanting to lay them all out, but I think that that's a really good place to start. Actually, just if one of your viewers would, even if there's suffering going on, and a situation that seems intractable, like no matter what that person does, it just refuses to come right. There's instruction there. You're participating in that. You're informing that with your belief system. And so one good place to start, and always the first step is to take a breath, step back, and be still. Just allow some stillness, allow some spaciousness. So you're not just sort of mentally working on it all the time and, sort of hitting it with a hammer to see where it'll break. But that after being still, then, the really good next step would be to ask, is there some truth I haven't told here, or some truth I haven't acknowledged here? In the case of codependent transactions, probably one of the best questions that you can ask if you find, you're in a relationship that's, just relentlessly distressing and, refuses to sort of work. One really excellent question, especially if you're considering some action like helping, in quotes, to ask, is this mine? Not is it true, is it false, is it good, is it bad, is it right, is it wrong? All of which tends to send us up into the mind, that kind of question. But is it mine? Is this mine to do? And very often, because of this because we know the truth very often. And we just know it. We possess that knowledge in forgetfulness, as Socrates says. And if we just ask the right question, is this mine? Very often we do know that it really isn't. And then it's just a question of whether you're going to honor and live up to what you know. I mean, you can know that and just sort of go charging in anyway to help and rescue and save somebody else, none of which is anybody's role or place or business. But just to start with that question, is this mine? If you're considering an action, to sort of help, there's that word again, help save somebody else or fix a situation or make things better, that, and when it's been relentlessly sort of troubling and disturbing, you can just ask, is this mine? And very often clients, especially on the call, like if it's couples counseling, you ask that question and there's really, I mean, the information is readily available. It's very obvious to one of the other, partners in the session that he or she's been trying to do something that belonged to the other person, that was rightly the other person's diligence. So, is there some truth I haven't told? Is this mine? There are other questions you can ask, kind of core questions. You can ask, is there something that I've left unsaid? That's a good one. And that may be a place where people can start. I wouldn't assume that if there's suffering going on, it's because of a conflict with a life principle. There are other ways that contradiction gets into the belief system than that. So that's one place we look, but we also look at other things.
Where are the other places that you look?
Well, for example, is the person saying yes when it's no or no when it's yes? I mean, that's to be in conflict with your own truth, your own sort of interior reality, and to show up in that kind of conflicted state where you're feeling one thing but saying another, or you believe one thing but what you're saying contradicts it. If you're in that sort of self-combat, then that's not going to go well, and that's going to produce suffering. So we listen for cues. Socratic listening, which is really kind of the method, is very subtle, and we listen for innuendo. We listen for the timing, like the pacing of how something is said. Is it said too fast? Is the client kind of jamming the signal of a question? Because if that's happening, it usually means it's the right question, right? We're listening for double entendres. We're listening for between the lines, kind of to hear what's going on, in the subtler and sometimes subterranean areas of the belief system. It's not always witting. Sometimes the beliefs are unwitting, and the assumptions. And so we're listening for these like tells, or indicators that there's something going on there that wants to be scrutinized and examined more closely. And then we kind of drill there, and that's where we put our attention, and we see what's going on there. I mean, I've had some amazing experiences with clients who came in to the session, made some offhand remark, like at the beginning of the session, that actually gave away the whole session. Just an opening remark, that, and usually in jest. Usually it's made, kind of to break the ice. And sometimes there's some tension, stress around any kind of counseling session, I imagine. And so people come in and they'll say something that sounds like it's irrelevant, but the counselor's always listening. And it's often been the case that a statement like that, just an offhanded, comment made in jest at the beginning, actually kind of telegraphs and anticipates the direction that the session ends up taking. So we're listening for a lot of things, that are going on in the client's belief system, a conflict with values, not just other beliefs that are non-controversial, but clients' values. We're listening for like wounded expectations, life script imperatives, things that are running, that the client in which the client might be so immersed that there's no conscious awareness that that's going on. So it's important sometimes to bring that stuff out of the shadows, look it in the eye, see it for what it is, and really scrutinize it, see if it has any credentials. If it's a contradiction or a false belief, it will have no credentials. That's another way of saying that it doesn't have the truth under it. So it won't hold up under Socratic scrutiny. And the minute the belief doesn't hold up, the minute that you bring it out and expose it as a false belief or a contradiction, the experience the client has in session is that for that moment, that belief is not convincing. It loses its credibility for a moment. And that's all you need, is that moment to identify what a better choice would be. And a better choice is, of course, by the client's own standard. It's not something that the counselor imposes.
Could you give a brief example of one of your favorite times when someone made an offhanded remark that ended up being crucial for the session?
Well, yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of them, but there was one fellow who, it was a couples session, and he had come to the session kind of reluctantly to please his wife, which is not always the greatest way to go into a session. I mean, ideally, you want people who are really committed to the process, self-examination of beliefs, self-work, and willingness to take responsibility and make better choices and all that. And so he got on the call, and the first thing he said was, what was it? Something like, well, I knew I'd either bring my drugs or my gun to the session. This guy was like a Texan. And he said, I knew I should brought either my gun, my drugs or my gun to the session. And it turned out that what was going on in the marriage was that this guy was in a false dilemma that he had to either be numb or violent. So those are the two ways to handle a problem. And he kind of telegraphed that at the very beginning of the session. So sometimes I just sit back and it just sort of shows up like that. So that was one. There was another where a young woman who wanted to be in a romantic relationship, it just like nothing she did was working. I mean, it was like conspicuously not happening in her life. And it's not like she wasn't trying, right? So she got on the call, and the first thing she said was, "Let me just tell you this up front." So already she's got my attention because I know that whatever she's going to say is going to be important for the session. She said, "I would rather never be in another relationship than be in another bad one." So she's showing me her belief system, right? She's in this false dilemma that those are her two choices. And it's very much in the nature of contradictions to set up as false dilemmas in the belief system. That what they do is they screen out a better third choice. And as long as the person is immersed in that false dilemma, it becomes a matter of the lesser of two evils. If for her, not being in a relationship was a better choice, given that the only other choice was to be in another bad relationship. So I just asked her, is there a third option here? That's all it took to kind of move us in the right direction. And then she realized that she could kind of hear herself, and she realized that she had kind of locked herself into this false dilemma that either way she went on that, she would suffer. Either be lonely or be abused. These are your two choices. So you pick the one that's the lesser of the two evils, but it's a lousy deal. I mean, you lose either way. And that's despite the fact that there's a payoff operating there that's completely understandable, right? It's better to be alone than to be abused. Yeah, I mean, if those are the only two choices, then I'll pick alone every day of the week. So it's not like what she was doing was not understandable. What needed to be questioned was whether or not those were her only two options. And her belief system had it wired that that's all she could see. It's one or the other. So pick the one that you can live with.
So it seems like telling and being in truth is doing a tremendous amount of work here. And that seems to be a really important facet for abiding in true nature, or recognition of true nature. You talked about cases of suffering in which they're cases of mistaken identity. So could you explain the relationship between working at at a level that's very human, telling truth and being in truth at a level that's very human, and how that relates to embodying what you've realized about identity?
I think we talked about this last time as in the language of what I was calling bottom up and top down work. Bottom up work, which is deconstructing, these constructs, calling out false opinions and contradictions, to see if they have any credentials, which they never do. That is, in the moment that they're exposed and you can see them for what they are, they're not convincing. that often leads to a practice of witnessing, which seems to be where there's some convergence there with top down, where just to is what I was saying earlier at the beginning of the call, just to disengage from what doesn't work seems to be a lot of it. It seems to be there's a lot of resolution, a lot of healing of transactions and relationships, a lot of, coming into alignment is facilitated by simply, refraining from what doesn't work. So it's not proactive in that sense. It's very much the Buddhist idea of, the sun is shining and maybe there's cloud cover, but you don't have to put the sun there. It's there and it's shining. You just can't see it because the clouds are in the way. So when the clouds, dissipate, then there's the sun and it was always there all along. It's a similar kind of idea. Jesus put it in terms of the truth, know the truth and the truth will set you free, or the truth will make you free. And it's like that. It's liberating to simply step out of contradiction and false opinion. That alone is often enough for things to start going better. I mean, you're not asking so much about the process of the bottom up, right? You're asking about where the two come together.
Yeah, it seems like bottom up has an important impact on the clarity of and ability of top down. Like when the sense of like truth is increasingly pervasive and accessed, and there's like kind of a reliable ground there, then it seems to add a lot of stability to top down.
I think that's true. I don't think it's linear. I mean, for one thing, if there are things going on at the level of the constructs, the beliefs, the assumptions that need to be brought out into the open and resolved through a better choice, or through, first of all, through the deconstruction, and then the better choice that brings in, that brings within reach, then just practicing awareness and witnessing, which is the top-down practice, you'll run into obstacles that will guide you back into the bottom-up approach. It's like, and I've run into this many times where clients would say, I'm having a lot of trouble witnessing, or I'm having a lot of trouble staying established in awareness. It's like, I feel restless and things are coming up. Yeah, well, that's not an accident. It's like, if there are things that need to be addressed in terms of the bottom up approach and deconstruction and all that, and you go top down, sometimes that will bring up the stuff that needs to be resolved. And, an analogy to that, which is actually a pretty good analogy, is if you're carrying a lot of old wounds that haven't been resolved, wounded expectations and, life script, trauma, or anything of that sort, that you're just carrying that. You're carrying it in the neural memory, you're carrying it energetically, you're carrying it emotionally, psychologically, however you're literally embodying that unresolved content or material that's going on. If you're doing that and someone offers you unconditional love, all of that pain's going to come up. And sometimes people are really confused by that. Like, why am I feeling bad? Like this person's loving me and I'm just feeling awful. Yeah, because the love finally provides you with the safety you need to allow yourself to feel that stuff that wants to come up and be healed and released. So it makes perfect sense from the standpoint of self-work. And it's the same kind of thing if you practice top down and you're kind of not ready to do that because there's still a lot of turmoil and turbulence, static going on at the level of the bottom up construct, then that will tend to come up as you're being still. And sometimes people think, well, I'm just not good at being still, but that's not what's going on. It's like being loved when you have a lot of old wounds that you're still carrying. Being still will create an opening or a spaciousness within which anything that's unresolved or unfinished can surface to be addressed and resolved and released. So they work together. I wouldn't rate them, one better than the other. They're different. They're different methods. Each one has its value. There are people who can do top down and they sort of bypass the need to do any kind of deconstruction from the bottom up. I mean, they find that they have access to the stillness. And look, I think that the point here is that this work of coming out of suffering and into alignment, of becoming more deeply established in the truth of your life, is really mysterious. It's just really a mysterious process. Sometimes it can be facilitated through this very conscious, deliberate process of asking the right questions, deconstruction of false belief, identification of better choice, that kind of premeditated method. that process will be facilitating. Other times it happens more through top-down stillness. And for some people that works and you can just bypass all that other work. And sometimes it happens without doing either. Sometimes it just happens spontaneously. And so it's very mysterious. We do our best to work with it, but it's ultimately, it's the healing of trauma, the healing of old wounds. This coming into alignment can happen just sort of mysteriously. Probably not your favorite kind of answer, but there it is.
So for most people on the planet, top down is going to be more accessible in some sense. Like it doesn't require a degree. It doesn't require like an outside person often with like a high degree of training and knowledge and subject expertise to help identify and point out unwitting beliefs. So it seems like top down is more accessible for most people and is more accessible most of the time, like even to myself or whoever, than bottom up approaches are. And so what is your recommendation or suggestion in terms of, the reality of that dynamic? You might have times in your life where the inquiry is very strong in terms of bottom up, where you're able to like find and deconstruct things like skillfully, but then other times you might not have like the energy or the insight in order to do the bottom up work in a skillful way. But the top down is always accessible. There's always the opportunity to like rest in non-resistance and like witnessing the constructs and energies that arise. So, what's your suggestion or perspective in this direction?
Well, I mean, I think that, we do talk about this as self-work. So there's that. I mean, there is this idea that this is something that one can do for oneself. There's also, I think also that PhilosophyCenter provides an essential service. So I think that sometimes we need help. Sometimes we need support and need someone to guide us to see beyond where we can see. And both are true. I don't think it's always the case that people have greater access to stillness and the practice of witnessing and awareness than they do have access to the constructs. Sometimes that's true, but I've had a lot of people who, as I said, they've tried to be still, they've tried to practice that, and what they find is that all kinds of stuff comes up that's really disturbing or turbulent or distracting, and they just say, I can't sit still. There's just too much going on. And that calls for a different kind of support. So, I understand what you're saying. In principle, stillness is always available in a way that philosophical counseling isn't, right? This is what you're saying. It's inarguable. Again, I would start with some very simple questions like, is this mine? What truth what have I not said that I need? What have I left unsaid? These are good places to start. And then, if a person needs more help than that, then I would recommend, doing some philosophical counseling. But a lot of people won't need that. A lot of people will find that they can answer those questions through this Socratic movement of recollection. That we do know the truth. And I've done a lot of work with clients who at the end of the session or the end of some number of sessions said, I knew all this. I knew all this. Well, yeah, there's knowing it, but then there's knowing what you know. There's having access to what you know. If we can possess the knowledge in forgetfulness, then it's there, but it's not accessible. And so we need to get access to it. And sometimes we can do that through self-work, just asking ourselves certain kinds of questions. It's not even something that needs to be formal, like, what have I left unsaid, or is this mine? It can also just be just really being still enough and willing. Willingness is like 90% of this work. Just willing to own whatever the truth is. And it feels like it just feels good. It feels like telling the truth always feels good. So I would suggest that if, like viewers who are suffering, especially chronically, especially in like one or more staging areas, which would be like love, health, supply, and life direction, if they're struggling like, persistently or chronically struggling in one of those areas, there's something going on that it's a construction waiting to be recognized. Life is trying to tell them something, and they're just not really listening. So just being still and asking, what's my part in this? There's this term co-creating that was popular some years ago. How am I co-creating this? Right? I mean, just the willingness. It doesn't mean that you're 100. It's not the idea that you see in some models that you're 100% responsible for everything that happens in your empirical reality. Like some of the Huna models talk about that. Neville Goddard talks about that. It's not that. It's just, what is my part in it? That I haven't been willing to acknowledge. And just to ask that question with the willingness to take responsibility for how you may be co-creating that with somebody else. Or it may not involve another person. Like, no matter what you do, you never have any money. That's, you're talented, you're intelligent, you got all of these things, you're ready to contribute, you're enthusiastic, but you never have two nickels to rub together. And that's not an accident. Then you can ask yourself, I mean, one really good question that you can ask yourself that we came up with some years ago, we call it the decisive question, and you're familiar with it, is to ask yourself, identify what you want. That's the first thing. I want money. I want, abundant supply, or at least, sufficient supply. Or I want to be in a good, healthy, loving relationship, partnership with somebody, or I want glowing health, or, whatever it is. And then once you've identified in a short phrase what you want, you can ask yourself, well, what bad thing happens if I have that, or I am that? So it's like asking yourself what bad thing happens if the good thing happens. And it's a paradoxical question in order to kind of make an end run around the mind, which we'll want to get in there and start figuring out and doing all these things that have nothing to do with working with this question, because it's all done in the body. It's really body work. So you ask yourself, what good thing happens if the bad thing happens? And then you try on the feeling of the good thing happening. And what you're going to find is the same thing I was talking about, where the resistance, whatever resistance is there, is going to come up. You'll feel it in the body somewhere. And then you just zero in on where you're feeling that and ask, well, what bad thing happens if I have money? What bad thing happens if I get close to somebody romantically? What bad thing happens if, and you state the good thing, whatever it is you want. And you're paying attention to the body. It's very important not to try to do this mentally. It's not a mental exercise. It's body work. And so the body will tell you, the body will resist if there's some contradiction there. Like if I had asked that woman who said, I'd rather never be in another relationship than be in another bad one. If I had asked her, well, what bad thing happens if you're in a relationship with someone? She would have had all kinds of alarms going off in her body, right? Because her belief system was that that's not safe. So that's a good, like, sort of starting point for self-work. What bad thing happens if, and then you plug in the phrase that represents whatever the good thing is, the thing that you want, and then pay attention to the body. Don't think about it. Feel about it. That's a really good place to start. Is it mine is a good question to ask. What have I left unsaid is a good place to ask. What truth have I not spoken? What truth have I not acknowledged? These are all really good places to start doing this kind of self-work.
So willingness is 90% of it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about willingness being 90% of it and how that fits in with this sort of Buddhist model that you talked about earlier about the sun that's always shining and the clouds that are obscuring that, and just talk a little bit about the dynamics there and how willingness fits in.
Well, willingness you can think of as non-resistance. And I say it's 90% of it because the truth is like the sun that's shining. You could say the truth of our alignment is like the sun that's shining behind the cloud cover of our false beliefs and wounded expectations and contradictions. It's like we clear that stuff away and the sun is there. There's nothing you have to do to put the sun there. It's already shining. It's already there. So it's the same idea. It's what is it that eliminates all of the stuff that's in the way of feeling the warmth of the sun and seeing the light in both senses. What's in the way is the mind, and particularly the tendency of the mind to jump into the drama triangle, obliterate all boundaries, and move into a state of drama and resistance, which is why it's called the drama triangle. It's like that's where all that, the mind loves that stuff. It revels in drama. It revels in resistance and, being against something and overcoming and defeating something. It's like so important to the mind body self to to win, to defeat the other, to, to be the best, to, America first. It's a sort of a puerile belief that creates a lot of suffering. And if you just, this is what I was saying pretty consistently this hour, if you just refrain from doing that stuff, then the sun is shining. So alignment just sort of comes forward. There's nothing you have to do to create alignment. The alignment is a function of truth. It's just what is. And so if we just, it's just like if I asked you, like say you have a radio blaring, loud music, and you're interested in hearing the birds outside. You can't hear them because of the radio. So if you just turn off the radio, suddenly you hear the birds. There's nothing you had to do. The birds are there. They're singing. Where are you? You're being blasted by this radio so that you can't, so that the truth of what you want can't reach you. It's like having filters and screens that are always in the way. And by simply disengaging from that, which in our terms really means disidentifying with that version of you that's invested or immersed in those payoffs of contradiction and false opinion, by simply disidentifying with that, you're pretty much home. I mean, that's pretty much the discovery of your alignment. And what does that? What allows that to happen? It's willingness. The willingness to, it's just a kind of softness that moves with things rather than against them. So that's why I say it's not done in the mind, because you're not going to find much of that willingness in the mind. The body is much more willing, to sort of come along and release things and appropriate other things, like appropriate the body's sense of alignment. And sometimes people can do that. Sometimes they don't have access to that feeling because it's too charged and they're too immersed in the payoff of whatever contradiction you're looking at in the session. If they're too invested in it and it's too charged, then they may not even be willing to let themselves feel what it would feel like to be the one that they would like to be. Like if I'm too intimidated or contradictions and false opinions are almost always fear-based. So if there's too much fear, if it's too charged, or like if it's linked to trauma in the belief system or something like that, they may not even have, the willingness may not be there to appropriate the body's sense of alignment. Like, what would it feel like to be with somebody, in a happy, loving relationship? And they can't feel it. They just won't go there. It's not safe. And the belief, they're really holding on to that contradiction. If that's going on, then you have to work with it in other ways. You have to kind of, it's the same idea for the counselor. You have to work with it, not just charge in willfully to try to uproot it or something. It won't work. You push creates pushback. So you find ways to sort of make an end run around whatever is blocked there, whatever's not accessible. But you don't find much that willingness in the mind. It's very resistant by nature. It likes to be against things. It likes to complain. It likes to make wrong. But the body is more willing, provided that the issue is not so charged that the person has no access to it. If that's the case, then I think some help is required, some form of support is needed to move through that. But for a lot of people, that's not necessary. And if they just ask the right question, they'll have that moment of recollection where they, the clouds part and there's the sun. I know a lot of people who have experienced that. And it wasn't even a process. The moment they saw through what they were doing and how they were co-creating their suffering, the moment they saw it for what it was like, I'm done. No more. That's it. Just like throwing a switch. I've seen it many times, and it's always remarkable. It's like the person reincarnates right in front of you into alignment. So that's very possible. The truth is always available to us. Think of it the way Socrates talked about it, as we gain access to the truth through an act of recollection. I think of recollection as just riding on a wave of willingness. If you're willing, it's like you have this knowledge. You may not have conscious access to it. You may not be consciously aware of what it is you, quote, know, but you can have access to it. You can know what you know if you're willing to. It all comes down to willingness.
So you've talked a lot about the mind here in this last segment, and in particular, the ways in which it makes it's really good at obscuring the truth, making a mess of things, falling into the drama triangle. So one issue with mind-body identification is that it makes the mind the master. And there's this important bit of wisdom that the mind is a good servant but a bad master. And so the top-down approach includes this like disidentification from mind and body that allows mind to be a good servant rather than a master. So could you unpack this a little bit and explain how it fits
I'm not
in?
sure I can unpack it better than you just did. I mean, yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly what you said is exactly right. I mean, good servant, bad master. The mind is not a bad guy. Contradictions and false opinions are not bad guys. Remember, they have a payoff that makes sense. It's understandable. There's a lot of fear that's driving them. So how is that not understandable? If somebody is too afraid to get close to somebody and therefore has concluded that, I just won't be in another. I mean, there's no bad guy. They're just contradicted or false beliefs are just extremely costly. They come with a tremendously high price tag. Like the guy who never has two nickels to rub together may be harboring a belief that it's bad to have money. You're a bad person if you have a lot of money. Money's the.
It's unspiritual to have money.
Yeah, exactly. Money is the root. Actually, the love of money is the root of all evil. Only bad people have a lot of it.
It's interesting how like memes of contradiction have become almost like folk tales of wisdom to confuse people. They're almost like mimetic, like viruses.
Yeah, I mean, they do confuse people. I hope that's not their purpose, but somebody is in contradiction and then, makes a YouTube video and passes that along or something. I don't know how that works, how it becomes a meme. But the point of that is that I think the point that we're sort of talking around here is that we don't need to necessarily have professional intervention. It's a very natural process to be in the truth, to tell the truth and to be truthful. And it's just that it's important to remember that when we slip out of or away from the truth, we're doing that for a good reason. It's like, our contradictions and our false opinions, just like the mind, they're not bad guys. The mind is a brilliant evolutionary development. Rational thinking, calculative, predictive, analytical thinking it's a miracle. But the mind also has certain limitations where if you are identified with the mind, that's the problem. It's not the mind, it's identification with that. If you identify with that, then it becomes the master, and that's not a good idea. Because the mind is not really constituted to recognize truth. The mind is like a probability machine.
Why is it not constituted to recognize truth?
Because anything can be true. It doesn't tell you what is true. Anything can be good or might be good, and that's as far as the mind can get. It doesn't tell you what is good. It doesn't tell you what is true. Like, for example, suppose you're uncertain, confused about whether to take a certain job offer. Your mind is not going to be able to tell you the truth there. Your heart can, the heart knowing, the body knowing, the gut knowing. That's a different faculty, and that's where the truth lives. And that's the right tool for the job. But if you go up into the mind, it's going to go into this series of narratives that are completely bound by probability thinking. It's going to say, well, you could take the job, and then A, B, C, and D would follow. And here are some really good reasons why you should take the job. On the other hand, the mind's favorite word is but. So as soon as you're starting to feel pretty good about that direction, you might say, on the other hand, here are the costs involved, and this is what you'll lose by doing that. And maybe not such a good idea. And so you start getting attracted to that line of thinking, that narrative. And then as soon as you're starting to feel like maybe you won't take the job, the mind says, but, and starts looking at other things. This is what the mind does. I mean, it's like a incredible, brilliant, living probability machine. And it just cranks out what you might do, what you could do. It doesn't tell you what you should do. It can't tell you because it doesn't recognize the difference between real and imaginary. I mean, if you imagine sucking on a lemon, you'll start salivating. You'll start having physiological reactions as though you're sucking on a physical lemon. The mind doesn't have any ontological red light that goes off on the dashboard to say, oh, this exists. This is the truth. It just says it could be. And so if the mind is your master, you're kind of stuck because You'll never be able to get beyond what you might do or could do. There's a deeper knowing which will tell you where the good is. The Greeks called it the daimon. It lives in the body. It's not human. I mean, they saw it as placed there by the gods at birth, that it's a divine spark or a spark of divine presence and knowing and wisdom. And so everybody has it, and almost nobody listens to it or checks in with it. But it's an unfailing guide, and it will tell you what the truth, your truth is, the truth of the situation for you, and it won't take any thinking. Thinking is highly overrated. But yes, good servant, no doubt.
So you mentioned that the mind isn't good at telling you the truth. It seems like it's important to distinguish between kinds of truths, because the truth you've been talking about here was like truth of life, direction, or what's a yes or a no. It's like an instrument that should be used for certain kinds of truths over others, it appears. Like your heart's not going to tell you special relativity. But like
Well, you're making an assumption here that special relativity is somehow an expression of the truth.
okay,
I don't know that I would agree with that. I tend to agree with Feynman that science doesn't deal with the truth. That science deals with degrees of certainty. And so, a model or a theory or a hypothesis or an interpretation becomes established as scientific truth if it's associated with a high degree of certainty. But how many times have we seen scientific truth revised when new evidence came along? I mean, it's the question you're asking a really far-reaching question here, which has to do with whether or not inductive truth, do we want to include that in what we mean by truth? I would say it's not particularly relevant to the truth of self-work, which is what I'm talking about. I think that you can establish with high degrees of certainty certain facts of science, or you could call them truths of science. At one time it was true that the celestial system was geocentric and the sun went around the earth, right, before Copernicus. And there was evidence. There was empirical evidence for it. You could go out on the beach. You could watch the sun arc through the sky going around the earth, right? And then Copernicus comes along, and based on certain mathematical principles, he concludes that it's not a geocentric system. It's a heliocentric system. And actually, it's the earth that's going around the sun. Now that becomes the truth, right? That supplants the earth is going around the sun. Now we have the truth, right? Yeah, until Einstein comes along and says, well, that's not exactly it either, because this has to do with inertial frames of reference. And I guess the best thing you could say with that is the truth you could assert with the highest degree of certainty would be that they're going around each other. It just depends on your frame of reference, what's going around what. See, so inductive truth by nature is always subject to revision. But when we talk about the truth of what's a yes and what's a no, or the truth of the life principles and so on, we're not talking about degrees of certainty. We're talking about is, isn't. And if you're, like, if I ask you, are you hungry right now? And you check in, you know what the truth, your own subjective states are self-evident to you. You'll know whether you're hungry or not. And that's not subject to, that's not going to change with new evidence coming along. It's a different kind of truth. And that's what the kind of truth that concerns us in philosophical self-work, because if people lose touch with that, if they start living like the way they think they should live, or the way somebody's told them to live, or in reaction to old wounds, or any 100 other things, then they lose that access to their own truth and they start suffering. And that's what we're trying to correct. Science is dealing with, you could talk about facts. Inductive truth is just a report of the scientific understanding of the facts to date, but it's always subject to revision. The way William James put it is, we can know things. He's talking about inductive knowledge. We can know, but we can never know that we know. We can't be absolutely certain. There's no absolute truth in science. There's no truth in that sense. It's always subject to revision. It's an approximation, or in Feynman's language, it's a question of relative certainties. And I leave that to the scientists. I'm not disputing the truth du jour. of scientific understanding.
Can I ask you one last question?
Yeah.
Okay, can I ask you another one?
Sure, you just did.
Two more. Yeah,
You
two
just
more.
did.
Can I buy two more?
Can I ask you two more? Is the way out of
Okay,
that?
thanks.
Yeah, sure. For you, anytime.
A long time ago, I sent you an email about, do you remember the one about getting out of the car?
Vaguely, but say more about it so it comes back.
Yeah, one second. I'm gonna see if I can find it really quick.
Oh, okay, great. I do remember the reference. I don't remember the context.
Yeah, I found it. One second. So this comes from part of a post by Scott Alexander on, I think the post is titled "Universal Love Said the Cactus Person." This is that story about, it's sort of like it's like a metaphor for awakening. The man is like driving the car, and he keeps going to people and asking about how is it that I'm to get out of this car, and people are like, okay, well maybe if you like go on the highway and drive a little bit faster and like hit some of these buttons, maybe then you'll be able to get out of the car. So he's like driving around the world and visiting all these people to figure out how to get out of the car. Eventually he visits, some other sage that tells him something like, okay, this isn't going to help you get out of the car, but I'm just going to tell you anyway. You just need to like turn the air conditioning on and hit these buttons, and then maybe you'll be able to get out of the car. And so he does it, and then he's not able to get out the car anyway still. So he drives away, sad that he's not able to get out of his car. I sent you this because I was interested in it, and you sent me a response that I quite liked, and I'm wondering if you could expand upon it, or if you have anything else to say about it.
I don't know. What was my response?
You said, spot on. The poor guy actually doesn't even need to get out of the car. He just needs to realize that he's already out and in, and that there's no difference, and that there's nothing to do, which is why he can't do it.
That's right. I agree with what that guy
Okay.
said. Yeah. Yeah, I would say the same
Okay.
thing to you today.
So what does it mean?
So what is it? What you're looking for me to
Yeah.
say something more about that? What more? What's missing for you? What's the missing piece?
Well, it's paradoxical.
Well, yeah, I mean, it should be pretty clear that the guy is in a state of resistance, right? Running around the world asking everybody, how can I be in a different situation than I'm in? And that's a failure method. I mean, how can that possibly ever go well? He's in a state of chronic resistance. And, this has very far reaching implications for like the whole law of attraction movement. And I mean, one of the great debacles of our time is this, infatuation that's probably kind. This almost deification of this whole principle of consciousness as cause. And it's all, I mean, if you look at some of the posts on Reddit about this and stuff, it's just as an example in response to what you're asking, you find almost like some ridiculously, like almost all of the posts are asking some form of why isn't this working? Why can't I get this to work? It's supposed to be a law. It's even
in terms of manifestation.
Yeah, it's even described as a scientific principle, like that's supposed to be rooted in quantum mechanics, and there's all of this stuff out there, which it's just snake oil. And the through line, I mean, the common element that all of these people have who are posting these things on Reddit or wherever and are struggling with this is the guy in the car. I mean, they're all in resistance to the situation they're in. And from that place of resistance, they're trying to use their will to change their reality. Well, where to start? I mean, for one thing, that can't be done through an act of will. For another thing, it can't be done in a state of resistance. You can't make anything happen. The will is almost entirely limited. This is why the mind makes a good servant but a bad master. I mean, it's another reason why. But you can let things happen. But to let things happen, you have to accept them as they are. So getting out of the car and being completely fine with being in the car are not different states. You can't get out of the car trying to get out of the car. Or if you want to understand this correspondence, this sometimes mysterious correspondence between local and non-local, or inner and outer consciousness and world, if you want to understand that, you could say you are creating your reality. Each of us is creating. That is, our consciousness, our beliefs, in particular, our assumptions are informing how the facts show up for us. They're informing our reality. So in that sense, we are creating our reality, but we're only creating our reality provided that we're not trying to create our reality. The moment you try to create your reality, you just become another post on Reddit. It's not going to work. It's not going to go well. And so this poor guy, in the car, his predicament is that he's in the mind and he's asking everybody's advice, which is a real sign of being in the mind, by the way. Whereas if he would stop, pushing the buttons and turning on the air conditioner is not a bad idea because it might get him sort of fascinated with his situation for a moment, and he might forget that that he's trying to get out of that situation. And in that moment, he might have an epiphany and realize that it doesn't matter whether you're in the car or out of the car, and that's how you get out of the car.
Sorry, say that last part again.
Yeah.
Just the last 5 words.
He might realize that that's whether you're in the car or out of the car, it's the same awareness. It doesn't matter if you're in the car, and that's how you get out of the car.
Doesn't matter if you're in the car.
It doesn't. It's the same. It's the resolution of all opposites. It's the practice of awareness. That reconciles all opposites. And if he could, but doing that would require putting down all resistance, the resistance of trying to get out of his reality, his present reality, because that's what locks it in. And that's why he can't get out of the car, because he's trying to get out of the car.
Willfulness sets up a counterintention. It presumes the thing isn't.
Sure. And pushing through the will always invites pushback. So it just increases the constriction. Whereas awareness, it opens it up into spaciousness where things have room to show up. And that's what this poor guy running around the world is waiting to discover, that there's a spaciousness. It was never far away. It was the cloud. It was the sun behind the cloud cover. And if he could, put down all resistance, it would be like the Zen koan about how do you get the goose out of the bottle. You remember that one? And the answer is there, it's out. It's that. It's the same thing. It's really wonderful. It's really funny.
So that's what's meant by he's already in and already out of the car. This resolution of opposites.
Yeah, that's available. It's Tennyson said nearer than hands and feet, but it's not even far enough away to be near. It's our very being. It's at hand, always available. It doesn't mean we're always available. It's like the sun. It's shining. Where are we? We're on the other side of the cloud cover. So we're saying, where's the sun? Where's the sun? I'm looking for the sun. I'm driving around the world looking for the sun. Pull over, sit still, look at the clouds, enjoy the clouds. That's what is. That's the reality right now, is the cloud cover. That's the car you're in. So you're just enjoying that. And at some point, the clouds just disperse and there's the sun. There was never anything to do. It's like Dorothy waking up in Kansas and realizing, oh, this never happened. She was home all along. This guy's out of the car all along. He just doesn't know it. He's dreaming. He's stuck.
So a metaphor for also mind-body immersion and non-local identity.
Yeah, or immersion in contradiction, false opinion is the same thing. It just creates suffering. We already have the knowledge. We possess it in forgetfulness, as Socrates says, but it's available to us the moment we're available to it, which is willingness. It's all about willingness. The willingness to change, the willingness to grow, the willingness to evolve, the willingness to look at something a different way, the willingness to take responsibility when there's responsibility to take, the willingness to make a better choice. It all comes down to willingness. This guy's pretty willful in the car. How do I get out of the car? Let me ask this guy, let me ask that guy, let me drive all over the world looking for the answer. The answer's not in the world. Thanks for doing this with me. It's so much fun talking to you, and it's always learn something. So I appreciate the opportunity, Lucas. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's a pleasure as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, you can help support the show by joining us on Patreon, link in the description. There you'll be able to get access to additional benefits that aren't available publicly. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to this show on YouTube or on your preferred podcasting platform by searching for Mew.